Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 147 of the Secunda. The topic for this lecture is fasting, and I'm Dr. Thibault. I imagine some people might be interested in this topic and might click on it without clicking on the rest of the videos, so just be aware that this is always in regard to the Summa Theologica. So this is according to question 147 of the Summa, secundae, the second book of the second book, and it's dealing with the cardinal virtue of temperance. Within the cardinal virtue of temperance is the virtue of abstinence, and the part of abstinence is fasting. So that's kind of the context. You look on it and you say, well, you didn't talk about this in regards to fasting. I'm only talking about what's basically what's in the Summa is what's connected. But I think it is very interesting because you probably hear a lot of the same things about fasting over and over again, particularly if you're getting into a season of Lent and you're looking at fasting. But this one is framed entirely from the Summa, so it does have some things slightly different, including that we're looking at stuff that is 700 years old, so it's not entirely aligned with what we might say today. If you're looking for what you should do, you should listen to the bishops of your church, not Thomas Aquinas, although, as you can imagine, it's mostly overlapping. So this has quite a few, it has 8 articles, so it is a very long section. So we'll jump right into it. So fasting, is it an act of virtue? Article 1. And yes, the answer in short is yes, it is an act of virtue. It is not a virtue in and of itself. So abstinence is a virtue. Fasting is an act of the virtue. It is so it's an act of a virtue. A little bit different than a virtue in and of itself. An act is virtuous through being directed by reason to some virtuous, and by virtuous using the term honest good. And it does it in 3 ways. Fasting does it in 3 ways. One way is it bridles lust of the flesh, so of the cardinal pleasures, which is really what temperance is about. Temperance is about balancing the pleasures of the earth, right? Food, drink, and sex. So it bridles that. It frees the mind for contemplation. Anybody who's ever had a good monastic experience with fasting might be aware of it. If you just do the fasting that the church prescribes on the few days a year, you don't always feel it because it's so minimal. You know, you could basically cut out one meal and have a slightly smaller second meal and no snacks, which you might not even notice. A lot of times days can go by so quickly that you might miss a meal. But a good monastic fast is a bit tougher, or Carthusian fast, where you might only get bread and water for the day. You notice that a bit more, and you spend long hours in prayer. It kind of breaks down. The body is often fighting for our attention, fighting for our mind's attention. I should do this, I should do that, I should go here, I should do this. When the body gets a bit tired, it slows down a bit, it just wants to sit. When that happens, the mind is allowed to contemplate a bit more. You get to feel your emotions a bit stronger. So in that regards, fasting frees the mind in some ways. And lastly, it is penitential. So missing meals, the idea of fasting to give it something up is something penitential. So it is virtuous in those 3 ways. And St. Thomas points out the difference between a natural fast and a faster's fast. We primarily are talking about a faster's fast, which is fasting for a purpose. I'm going to give up this meal for penance, for opening myself up for greater contemplation, to bridle the flesh. You're doing it for a reason, versus a natural fast, which is just there's two ways of looking at it, but the primary way that he's talking about it here is that we fast between meals naturally, right? When we go to sleep at night and before we wake up in the morning, we're fasting. We're not eating, right? When we're asleep, right after you finish breakfast, you're probably not going to start snacking a half hour later. You just ate a whole meal. All right, so between meals are natural fasts, but this isn't the same as a faster's fast, which is fasting with a real intention. Even though you're hungry, you're not going to eat. Right? That's not the natural fast. That's an intentional fast. The second article is quite short. Uh, is fasting an act of abstinence? Yes. Yeah, fasting deals with food, and abstinence deals with the moderation of food. Therefore, fasting deals directly with abstinence. So, short. Is fasting a matter of precept, meaning law? Is it is a matter of law? And the answer is yes. So St. Thomas goes very strong at the beginning of this with big caveats cut out right in the contra arguments saying, if a person is fully righteous and holy, doing everything right, maybe they're not dealing with lust. Lust isn't an issue. Uh, they already are reaching spiritual heights of contemplation. They don't need to fast in order to do it. Okay, you got that. And let's say you've gone to confession, you've done your penance, you don't have anything to be penitential about particularly. Uh, then you might not need this, right? It might not be important to you. He puts that very strongly in there, or there's other reasons why not. But in general, yes, there are precepts, there are laws to fasting. It says like secular authorities make legal laws for the good of the commonweal, the people. The church authorities have make religious laws for the spiritual sake of the people. So, are all secular laws perfect and perfectly adapted to every individual in every situation? No, but we do a pretty good job of saying, well, this is the law, but these are the exceptions to the law, right? You can't kill, but you could in self-defense, right? You put that into law, the exceptions. The same with these spiritual laws, right? We should fast. Okay, we're going to do this. We got to make, let's set it out. But there are exceptions, and in those exceptions, the Thomas talks about, the church talks about. We'll get into those. Now, this like natural fast, right? We just talked about natural fast. Middle of the night when you're asleep, that's a natural fast. Right after you ate a meal, you're not hungry, so you're not going to eat. That's a natural fast. Like there's a pattern of eating naturally. There is also a pattern in fixed set times of spiritual fasts. So typically in the morning, lunch, dinner. That's kind of a natural pattern of eating for us. Uh, well, spiritually, Lent, the time of fasting. Uh, Advent might be a time to take on some fast. The Ember days, as he talks about, are other days. Right? There's a certain pattern of fast, just like there's a natural pattern of fasting within the world as well. Um, and people in general need this, right? People need penance. In general, people need to calm the body and open their mind to greater contemplation. Right? In general, people need to curb their desires of lust. So, in general, this is a spiritual. These are three spiritual things that need to be worked on by the average Christian. Therefore, the church makes rules for the average Christian to put them in the right direction, and then we move forward, right? So, it's not to be legalistic for the sake of legal, but for providing general good counsel for the average person, right? That's what this is for. In the present moment, we find the one exception, and we say this one exception doesn't, contradicts the rule. Therefore, we should eliminate the rule altogether because we wouldn't want anybody to feel left out. Well, the church doesn't really. follow that. If most people could benefit from it, then let's do it, and we'll make the exceptions for for those who can. We don't base the rule on that. If some people had their way, we would all have gluten-free hosts because some people are have celiac disease. Well, we're not going to do that. If a person has celiac disease, then they can receive from the chalice instead. Well, the person is celiac and they're an alcoholic. Well, then they can spiritually, their desire to receive the communion is sufficient enough in that case. Very against how we think as modern people, but this is kind of practical sense. Practical sense. Right? Don't hold everyone's hand to make sure nobody's feelings are hurt. We kind of make principles that guide like the everyday person, common person. Otherwise, we can't make any statements. Now, are we bound to the fast? I kind of alluded to that in the last question, Article 3. And we are bound to the fast. In general, we are bound to the framework which is established, benefits people. This is for the benefit of people. Now, St. Thomas gives this line, it is lawful for a man to use his own judgment in omitting to fulfill the precepts. There are situations where the fast isn't appropriate, right, for a person. Some of these examples are children, particularly under the third quarter of the 7th year of life. They're in a growth spurt. They need to eat. A 4-year-old kid gets grumpy when they don't eat. He just gives them the food. They're growing. People who are beginners, right? Somebody who's new to this, they just converted and they're just discovering fast. You see this perhaps more in religious life where communities really fast than what we do see now, because now it's, I'm new to Christianity. I can't skip one meal Ash Wednesday and one meal on Good Friday. Really? I think you can. I think you can do that. But in religious life, if somebody becomes a Carthusian and there's pretty strict fasts, if somebody's a new Carthusian, the community knows you give that person a little bit of extra food to ease them into the life. Right? So the beginners. A pilgrim is another example. Presumably pilgrims are walking long hours a day to get to their spiritual destination. Therefore, they might need to eat because they're 20 miles a day. You might need to eat something more than one meal a day. Working people are another one thrown in there. In an age of quite a bit of manual labor, a person could pass out and die. Fall off something and die. Or if somebody's a watchman in the night protecting the city, if they don't eat something, they're going to be weak and they're going to fall asleep more easily. And then somebody could attack the city and the whole city is destroyed because the watchman didn't have anything to eat. Well, give the watchman something to eat. Right? Their spiritual life is important, but let them fast at another time, not when they're keeping watch. Right? These are very practical things. Poor people can't keep the fast. St. Thomas says, poor people eating one meal a day is probably what they do anyway, so just keep doing that. But if you're a beggar, you're exempt because maybe you can only get the food when the person gives it to you, right? You might only get a scrap here and a scrap there, but when you get to eat, because you don't have the luxury of saying, well, I'm going to only eat at 3 p.m. or noon or whatever. If you're a beggar, you eat when you get the food, right? So there's an exception for them. And then the sick. We frequently throw in the elderly, but I really don't see that in the Summa, in this section, an exemption for the elderly. And if anything, St. Thomas gives the opposite example, that the elderly and the virtuous are more able to do the fast because they are more experienced in doing it. You probably see this in monastic communities too. An old monk, even though they don't have to keep the fast, they probably will more than perhaps a young monk who is still getting into the routine. So the sick are. So if somebody is sick and elderly, right? Well, then they're also sick. So then there's an exception. But if you are elderly and healthy, then there's less of an exemption. And again, the righteous, if you are perfectly righteous, you don't need to keep this because you don't need the fruits of it. You already have it. But I would tend to think that a truly righteous person would keep the fast because they're righteous, right? Why not? And then that line again from the second one on this screen, that a lawful person can use their own judgment. Use your own judgment. I probably shouldn't say this because I could get myself in trouble, but when years ago, I recall when Pope Benedict was on an airplane to Africa, and there were reporters on the plane, and they often ask the Pope questions while they're on these plane rides. And one of the reporters asked the Pope on the plane ride, what if a person has HIV and HIV positive, and they're married? Can they use a condom in their marriage? And this is one of these big, I guess, a big question. Contraception's one of those hot button issues. I wondered, like, does the reporter think the Pope is going to overturn the Church's teaching on contraception on an airplane ride off the cuff? Uh, of course, he's going to stick with what the Church has taught within its documents. That would be the responsible thing to do. But I also think within that question is kind of a silly question, right? It's kind of an I gotcha question because if a person they brought it up because he was going to Africa where there was a lot of HIV at the time. If a person they're vaccinating people with the same needles and somebody catches HIV because they got vaccinated with an infected needle, they're married, and they find out before the spouse catches the disease. Perhaps they're even older in life; they've already had their children. Um, you know, should the husband use a condom in order to stop his wife from catching HIV? Um, why are you asking the Pope this question? Right? Can you use, if a lawful man, a faithful Catholic man, is in this situation, can you not trust them to use their own judgment of fulfilling and omitting to fill the precept, the law of double effect? You can look at that. The goal of it is to keep the conjugal act, the union of husband and wife, but to avoid the spread of that highly infectious disease to the wife. I think that a law like this is written right in the Summa. I think is a very practical thing, right? This idea that we have to look to the Pope to give us all the answers, all the micro answers. I think the Church gives, at least within the Summa, the Church gives good common sense, right? Use your practical reason. Now, how about the times and fastings? Times of the fast. Are they a good thing to have? Well, again, fasting is directed towards two things: the deletion of sins, a penitential aspect, and a raising of the mind to heavenly things that focus on the contemplative life. Um, so because those are the two purposes, they fit within the liturgical calendar, right? So times of particular times of penance or meditation and prayer, right? In preparation for Easter, for example. So that's why we do it during Lent. In preparation for Christmas, right? That's another time we focus on a penitential aspect. St. Thomas goes into great detail about in preparation for ordination. The whole community would perform penance and prayer in preparation of ordination, an ordination within the community. And then he also brings up Ember Days, which are 4 times a year. Every 3 months is basically an Ember Day, which is 3 days of fasting. Lent is one, Christmas time is another. The Holy Cross is another. If you Google Ember Days and put in the year, you'll find out the Ember Day fasting days. They've officially been thrown out since 1966. Seems to be a long tradition within the church, though, so I wonder if they might not sneak back in. We'll see. You can always optionally do it, though. There's no reason you can't choose it. Nothing says you can't fast on the 3 days following the Feast of St. Lucy. You won't get excommunicated for that. St. Gregory also points out the 40 days. Now, this is kind of interesting because if you were to look it up today, the things you would probably hear would be slightly more scriptural, right? Well, Jesus is 40 days in the desert. There you go. You have 40 years of the Jews in the desert before entering the promised land. You have the flood, right? You got another 40 days. But there's a lot of references to 40 days within Scripture, so it seems to make sense. But the ones that St. Gregory points out and St. Thomas is pointing out are a little bit more esoteric and perhaps a bit more Jewish. If you ever listen to Jewish numerology, it sounds very similar to this. So if you got the 10 Commandments and the 4 Gospels, you multiply them, you got 40. So therefore, 40 days is a good one. Another one, there's 4 elements of the body, and there's 10 commandments, since fasting is to overcome the body, things of the flesh, and you overcome it with the 10 commandments, therefore 40. Right? Okay. And then the third one that St. Gregory points out, which I like this one a little bit more than the previous 2, is there's 365 days in the year. If the rule is that we tithe 10% to God, well, 10% of a year is around 40, right? 336. Right? If you take the Sundays out of Lent, you get around, you're getting closer to the 36 mark. Roughly 10% of your year is in fasting if you fast during Lent. So I think that's probably a pretty good one. And then St. Thomas adds this kind of fourth one in there. This one's really, if you thought the other ones were tough, this one's really tough. But you got the 3 people of the Trinity, and then you add that Jesus told us to love our God with all of our heart, all of our mind, and all of our soul. So now you got 6. And there's 4 creatures, heat, cold, wet, and dry. And then if you multiply them by the 4 elements of the body, because the body causes us to sin, therefore that's why we have to fast, now you have 40. But some of this is very Jewish numerology in some ways, like math. Now, fasting allows for eating once. This gets into how do you fast. So eating once a day, St. Thomas thinks, is a perfectly good fast, because the purpose of fasting, according to the church, is to bridle the concupiscence, balancing the pleasures of the earth, right? Pleasures of the flesh, and to safeguard nature. Right? So those are the 2 purposes. So if you eat 1 meal a day, it meets your needs of nature. Right? You're not going to starve to death eating 1 meal a day. Eating 1 meal a day is enough. But it's enough also to curb concupiscence. You're not going to get overly pleasurable with eating only 1 meal a day. And this is pretty similar to the Carthusian way of living. You don't get a breakfast, you eat 1 big meal for lunch, and then at dinner time you get a few light things like some fruit or something like that, a piece of cheese or something in the evening. So you only really have 1 meal a day. So I think some Benedictines do this as well. Right, so 1 meal a day is enough. And points out that water breaks the fast for the Eucharist, but for one who is fasting of the faster's fast, you can drink water because you need it for digestion and you need it to survive. So you can drink water. But Eucharistic fast, which he calls the natural fast. That's the other kind of natural fast. Usually when he talks about natural fast, he's talking about fasting between meals. This he calls the natural fast before the Eucharist, and you can't have water before the Eucharist. Now the time of the fast. So if you're only going to eat one meal a day, when should that one meal be? Well, he says properly at the 9th hour, and by the 9th hour, he means 3 p.m. That's if you want a translation. He calls it the Lord's hour, the hour the Lord died. Well, that's 3 p.m. So the 9th hour is 3 p.m. So people typically eat at the 6th hour, he points out, which is noon, would be noon. But if you're fasting, push it back 3 hours. So it's still one meal a day, but you pushed it back a bit more. He points out that we typically eat at noon. Now, this is an interesting section if you're interested in some of this medieval science. You don't want to eat at night because it's cold and your body's cold and it needs to preserve the heat. Therefore, you don't want to eat at night, and you want to eat when it's warm because the body needs the nourishment when the body's hot. So if you're interested in that type of thing, it's kind of interesting. So noontime is hot. The body needs refreshment to get through the heat of the day. So if you push it back a bit, to the 3 p.m., it's a bit of a fast. But he points out it's only 3 hours difference. It's not like it's pushing it back to 6 p.m. It's only pushing it back a little bit. So you should be able to do it. It's not that hard, not that difficult. But if you can't, then just eat your meal at noon, right? If you can't do it, eat it at noon. And if you're sick and you can't, then don't do that. St. Thomas almost became the abbot of Monte Cassino Benedictine Abbey, and ended up becoming a Dominican. But a lot of this sounds like very Benedictine common sense. If you read the Will of Benedict, it seems very likely that St. Thomas has used some of St. Benedict when it came to this. Now the fast, what should you fast from? This abstinence within the fast. Well, he points out that meat, eggs, and milk foods are what you should abstain from with fasting in particular. Not just eating a small meal, but abstaining from these things. So, and he points out, you can get into, it's kind of interesting to read in an esoteric way, like the book of Leviticus or Deuteronomy, but the flesh of animals that take their rest on the earth and who breathe air, right? So this would be animals that would be not whales because they don't rest on the earth, and they don't, but they do breathe air. Right? Fish don't breathe air, so they breathe the oxygen from the water. So then you can eat fish, but fish can, but you can't eat animals on the earth. But it seems like you maybe some type of birds that are in the air, right? You can kind of, it's a bit of a riddle. You can't drink milk from animals that walk the earth. I'm not sure what other type of milk there is. Milk from animals that are in the water. I don't know. And then eggs from birds, which I guess you could eat eggs from turtles or something like that, but you can't eat eggs from birds. And these products create, according to St. Thomas, an excess of seminal matter, which leads to lust. Right? It makes one person more lustful because it increases their semen. And this is a very interesting point. If anybody ever uses this in a class, it's an interesting one. Is why not meat? Talk about this sometimes. Why can you eat fish and you can't eat meat? Why can't you eat these things? It's really coming out right. To say we need to cut back on food. Well, that's universal. Right? That's a universal thing. It's good for contemplation. It's good for penance. Okay, yeah, all that. That's universal. It's not going to change with time. This is very science-based. This part, though, why meat? Because procreation requires heat, spirit, and humor. Heat is actually the body heat. they believe that male or female is created based on the heat within the womb of the woman. Heat matters, right? If a woman wasn't properly warm, right? You can see this maybe more dog going in heat, right? If you're not properly in heat, you can't get pregnant. So heat matters. The spirit matters, which would be coming perhaps more from the male. Um, and the humors, which is fluids. If you think back to ancient science, it's the blood, it's the phlegm, it's the bile. These are the humors within the body that keeps a person healthy, the balance. So these are required for procreation. And he says wine gives the heat. Uh, Flatulent foods, which I find as vegetables, they give the spirit. And meat gives the humors. The meat has the longest effect. The humors have the longest effect. Um, Wine heats you up for a little bit, like heats you up for an hour and then it cools you off. You eat the vegetables, you get some flatulence, and then it passes. But the meat gives you real, uh, strength, energy, humors. It has a longer effect. So because meat is the most potent of these three, meat is the thing that you give up. That's kind of an interesting topic of why are Catholics giving up meat during Lent and these things because of this very medieval view of procreation. Really. Um, uh, we might want to nuance it, but this is some of the medieval origins of this idea of not eating meat. Now, in conclusion, fasting is an act of virtue. Right? It's not a virtue, but it's an act of a virtue. Fasting is an act of abstinence. Food is an element of abstinence, so they go together. Fasting is a matter of precepts. The church is allowed to have authority over making spiritual laws that affect spiritual life, and fasting affects spiritual life. So they do. It is good for the common Christian, so they make laws that are for the good of the common Christian. People are bound to these laws of the fast of the church, but within it are built many exceptions to keeping the fast. There are special times of fasting, just like there are natural times of eating and sleeping and everything else. There are natural times of fasting throughout the liturgical year. Uh, Fasting, when you fast, you eat once a day. In that time, most people would have eaten only once a day anyway. But you push it back to 3 p.m. if you can, in order just to give yourself a little bit more of a challenge, a little bit more difficult, but not too difficult. And there's a prohibition against meat, eggs, and dairy when fasting. It's that medieval belief, that the ancient belief that meat affects humors, and the humors have a long-term effect on the body and sexual lust. So therefore, holding back from meat gives a person calming sexual libido. Therefore, that's what you should do. So next we will move into the vices associated with abstinence.